So Anne, tell us about the journey from California to Indonesia.
Well, the trip, the first part of the trip was 21 days. And we never touched land. We sailed south of the Hawaiian Islands and south of all the little islands until we reached Balikpapan in Borneo.
And what kind of ship was it?
It was a freighter. It had been commissioned in the United States. It was very modern and up to date. Carried 12 passengers. I had a private room, stateroom, and private bath. And under my bunk, I was carrying 2 cases of Chinese, 2 cases of champagne, and 5 pounds of granulated sugar in order to make the wedding cake. Because the sugar in Java, I had been told, I had been warned, was very gray and coarse. Anyway, I also had with me 2 steamer trunks. And in case you don't know what a steamer trunk is, it stood about 4 feet high. It was square, I would say 2 feet square. It parted, it opened, very much like a window opens, like this. And on one side was a hanging space for clothing, and on the other side of the trunk were drawers. So those were packed solidly with my trousseau and wedding gifts. And I also had a flat steamer trunk, and that was packed solidly. Well, those didn't fit in the stateroom that I was in. Those were someplace in the ship. The passengers were a very interesting and odd assortment. There was a French woman who had spent the war years, World War II, in Santo Tomas prison camp in the Philippines. And there was an American woman who was going back to Bali in the Netherlands East Indies. Bali was part of the Netherlands East Indies, to complete compiling a Balinese English dictionary. There was a missionary family and 3 children, and they were going to the jungles of Sulawesi. And there were a couple of Dutch soldiers who were going back to Java to rejoin their regiments. And there was a very attractive young woman, married with 2 children. She was going to join her husband, who was working for an oil company in Sumatra. So those are my shipmates. And several of them featured later in my story. The second port of call was Makassar, and that was in Sulawesi. When we got to Makassar, we were overly late on our trip, and Harry had made plans and was very anxious for me to get to Surabaya, where we were going to be married. So he suggested that I jump ship and fly the rest of the short distance from Makassar to Surabaya. If these names are unfamiliar, look them up on the map. Java is a tiny little island, the most densely populated island in the whole world. Even in those days, 1947, it had 100 million people. Nowadays, it's 200 million. But back to Makassar briefly, because the overnight that I spent there, I went with various company people who had come to meet me at the ship, and was taken to the local club for dinner. And it was at the local club where we sat around a round table and drank beer and ate peanuts that I suddenly realized that I was going crazy. My legs were on fire. And I reached down and tried to claw at them, and they all thought it was very, very funny. And they called for a can of flit, the old-fashioned flit gun that went like this. Well, I guess they still do, but it held DDT. And they sprayed the DDT under the table, and that killed the mosquitoes. And they gave me a sarong to wrap around my legs. And I did eventually develop some immunity to the mosquitoes so that their bites were not as vicious and painful in later years. When I left the ship in Makassar to fly to Surabaya, it was my very first flight. And I wasn't the least bit scared. I was excited. We got to what was called a runway. It was a strip of cleared grass. And there was one plane on that strip. It was a DC-6, I believe. There were DC-3s and DC-6s. Well, this was one prop, and there were chocks in front of the wheels to hold it in place. And I climbed aboard with all the other passengers who were Malays and Chinese. I was the only Caucasian. And we sat on bucket seats on either side of the plane. And all the luggage was piled in the middle of the plane and held down by strong straps. And included with my little brown suitcase were string bags of live ducks and chickens. So when we were ready to take off, the pilots, and there were 2 Dutch pilots, revved that airplane up to absolute frenzy until it just shuddered and shook on the runway, and then they pulled away those chocks from the wheels, and the plane lurched and bumped forward and finally took off just before it would have plowed into the jungle. I think it was about an hour and a half to get to Surabaya, and I landed on an airstrip which was slightly better than the one I had left. This one was, I think, a dirt or gravel or something airstrip. And they even had a little house which served as the waiting room ticket office. We all got off the plane, and it was amazing. I couldn't believe it. All of those passengers, they just seemed to disappear. They seemed to melt away. They were all gone. And I was left there standing in the middle of the runway next to this airplane, looking around. I was sort of dazed. And one of the Dutch pilots came back to me and said, "Are you being met?" And I said, "I think so." Fortunately, I had a telephone number, and I gave him Harry's telephone number. And he went in and made a call. And I sat, and then they too disappeared, the pilots. And I sat outside this little house ticket office on a couple of crates and waited maybe 10 minutes, when around the corner with spinning wheels came a black Chevrolet, and that was Harry.
Okay, that was great. So now we'll do the wedding.